My name is Evelyn Marsh, and I am 63 years old, and I spent 29 years as a family court paralegal, which means I spent nearly 3 decades watching. People say one thing out loud and mean something else entirely, and I learned early that the most important information in any room is rarely what is being said. It is what is being carefully not said, and I did not expect to need that particular skill at my own son's Christmas dinner table, but life has a way of calling on everything you know at the moment you least expect to need it, and I want to start by telling you about my daughter-in-law Cassandra, because it matters that you understand who she is before I tell you what she said. My son Thomas met Cassandra 4 years ago at a work conference in Denver. She was in marketing, and she was good at it, the kind of good that comes from understanding how things look to other people before those people have even formed an opinion. She had an eye for presentation and a talent for making a room feel curated, and I recognized that quality immediately because I had spent years in courtrooms watching people curate themselves, and Thomas was 36 when they met. And he had waited a long time to find someone, and I saw how he looked at her, and I chose to focus on that and not on the smaller things I noticed in the first year. And the smaller things were this: Cassandra did not ask questions, she made statements dressed up as questions. And there is a difference that most people do not catch right away. She would say things like, "Wouldn't it be easier if you just came to us for the holidays instead of us driving out?" And the sentence had a question mark at the end, but it was not a question, it was a conclusion that had already been reached and was simply being announced. And I noticed this the way I noticed things in depositions when a witness was steering rather than answering. And I said nothing because Thomas was happy, and I had raised him alone after his father left when Thomas was 11. And I had spent years making sure he had reasons to be happy, and I was not going to be the reason he stopped being, so the pattern established itself quietly the way patterns do when no one names them. I drove the 40 minutes to their house for every occasion because Cassandra said the parking near my apartment was difficult, and I brought food every time because Cassandra said she never knew what to cook for me, and I stayed exactly as long as she seemed comfortable and left before I was asked to, and I told myself this was generosity, but sitting here now I know it was accommodation, and there is a difference between those two things as well. 3 weeks before Christmas, Thomas called me on a Tuesday evening, and he sounded the way he sounds when he is relaying information he did not originate, which is slightly too casual, the way people are when they are delivering news they expect will be met with resistance. "Hey Mom, so Cassandra is thinking Christmas at ours this year, big family dinner, her parents, the cousins, maybe 20 people, and she was wondering if you could handle the cooking since you are so much better at it than anyone." I sat in my chair by the window and I looked at the streetlight outside, and I said, "How many dishes, Thomas?" And he said, "Oh, you know, the usual." And I said, "Thomas, how many dishes?" And he went quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Cassandra made a list." And I said, "Send it to me." And it arrived 3 minutes later, and it was 11 dishes for 22 people, with a note at the bottom that said, "Kitchen will be free from 7 a.m. And I want you to sit with those words for a moment. Kitchen will be free from 7, not would you be willing, not we would so appreciate. It just the kitchen will be free from 7, the way you tell a contractor when the site is unlocked. And I typed back, "That is a lot for one person." And Thomas replied, "Cassandra says you have done more than this before," which was true, and also not the point. I did not sleep well that Tuesday night, not because I was angry, but because I was thinking, and The thing I was thinking about was a document I had helped draft 14, months earlier, a straightforward estate planning update that my attorney, Robert, had handled, and that Cassandra and Thomas did not know existed and had never asked about, because in 4 years neither of them had ever asked me a single question about my finances, my savings, my property, or my plans, and I thought about what it meant that no one had ever asked. And on the Sunday before Christmas, Thomas and Cassandra had the family over for what Cassandra called a casual pre-holiday dinner, and the conversation turned to Christmas, and I said gently that 11 dishes for 22 people was a great deal for one person, and Cassandra looked at me from across the table with the warmest smile she had, and said, "Evelyn, you make it look so easy," which is a sentence that sounds like a compliment, and is actually a door being closed, and Thomas looked at his plate, and I watched my son look at his plate, and I understood that he had been in that room with Cassandra long enough that her conclusions had begun to feel like his own, and on the drive home I called my sister Ruth, who had retired to Asheville 2 years ago, and I said, "Ruth, is the offer still open?" And she said, "Which offer?" And I said, "Christmas." And she went quiet for half a second, and then she said, "Evelyn, I have been waiting for you to say that for 2 years. And I said then, I am saying it now, and that was that the texts kept arriving that week Monday, a reminder about the dinner rolls needing to be homemade Wednesday, a note that Cassandra's mother was gluten intolerant Friday, a question about whether I could arrive at 6:30 instead of 7, and I replied to each one, "I am working on it," which was true. I was working on something, just not what Cassandra assumed. And 6 days before Christmas, I drove to Robert's office and told him everything, and when I finished, he looked at me and said, "So what do you want to do?" And I told him, and he said, "I thought you might," and when I left his office, the December air was cold and sharp, and I felt something I had not felt in longer than I wanted to admit, which was that I was making a decision for myself. The night before Christmas, I packed a bag. I packed my good wool sweater and my walking shoes and the book I had been meaning to start for months, and I set my bag by the door, and I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat at my table, and I wrote a note on the back of an envelope. The note said, "Thomas, I love you, and I will always love you. I am not able to cook Christmas dinner for 22 people alone," I said so, and I was not heard. I am going to see Ruth. I will be back on the 28th. All my love, Mom. And I put the note on my kitchen table, and I called my car service, and I drove to the train station in the early dark, and I felt the particular quiet of someone who has made a decision and is now simply letting it be made. And Ruth was waiting at the station with 2 coffees, and her dog Chester, who pressed his head against my knee the way dogs do when they understand something is being released. And we drove to her house through the mountain dark, and her house smelled like wood smoke, and Pine and she had made soup, and I thought this is what it was supposed to feel like, and it was Thomas, called at 9:47 Christmas morning, and I said, "I am in Asheville with Ruth," and there was a silence, and he said the dinner, and I said, "I know," and I said, "I told you it was too much," and I said it more than once, and no one heard me, and I am not able to keep making myself available to people who do not hear me, even you. And he said, "I know, Mom," and his voice was different. And I said, "Go take care of your guests, and we will talk when I am home." And Ruth poured more coffee. And Chester put his head back on my knee, and outside the mountains were doing what mountains do, which is simply exist without explaining. Themselves and I found that very comforting. The Christmas dinner happened. Without me, Cassandra ordered from a restaurant, and it arrived in foil, containers, and the 22 people ate and went home, and nothing was remarkable about it, which was perhaps the most important thing that had ever happened at one of Cassandra's dinner tables. Thomas came to my apartment when I returned, and we had the kind of conversation we had not had in 3 years, the kind where both people are present and neither one is, performing, and at the end of it he said, "What can I do differently?" And I said, "Start by hearing me the first time," and Cassandra called 4 days into January and said what you did was hurtful, and I said, "Cassandra, I understand that, and sending someone a list and calling it an invitation is hurtful too," and she called back 3 days later and asked questions for the first time, and it was not a resolution, it was an opening, and an opening was enough. I signed up for a watercolor class on Thursday. Mornings I booked Asheville again for March, and one Saturday morning I made myself breakfast and sat at my own kitchen table in the quiet winter, light with nowhere to be, and nobody expecting anything from me, and I thought this is what it was supposed to feel like all along. Not the cooking for 22 people, not the 6:30 arrival, just this, my own kitchen, my own morning, my own life. And if someone has handed you a list recently and called it "Love, I want you to hear this," you are allowed to put the list down. You are allowed to go somewhere that feels like wood smoke and pine, and a dog who understands you without being told, and the note you leave on the table is not abandonment, it is information. And sometimes information is the kindest thing you can give someone who has forgotten to ask.